A distinctive family heirloom leads a wealthy man to question everything about his supposed inability to have children. Within the confines of luxury, two identical faces and one ancient necklace weave a tale of impossible connections. Between precious metal and precious truth lies a story that will redefine the meaning of inheritance. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The silence in Arthur's mansion was a heavy cloak, woven from the hushed grandeur of priceless antiques and the echoing emptiness of vast, underused rooms. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass windows depicting scenes of mythical hunts, painted the polished marble floors in shifting patterns. But the light couldn't reach the shadows clinging to Arthur's soul. He sat alone, the weight of his childlessness pressing down like a physical burden. His life, a gilded cage, felt more like a tomb. A velvet-lined box, nestled on his antique writing desk, held the key to this suffocating loneliness. An ancient necklace, crafted from silver filigree that seemed to writhe with an inner light. Its intricate design, a tangle of serpents and entwined hearts, pulsed with a strange energy. He traced the cool metal, his touch hesitant. This heirloom, a legacy from a past shrouded in mystery, was his only tangible connection to the parents he barely remembered. Their sudden deaths, a car crash deemed an accident, had left him an orphan, adrift in a sea of inherited wealth. He picked up the necklace, the weight surprisingly substantial. A subtle click, almost inaudible, alerted him to a hidden clasp. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside, nestled amongst the silver, lay a faded photograph. Two identical boys, barely older than toddlers, stared back at him from the sepia tones. Their wide, innocent eyes held a mirror to the deep-seated sorrow in Arthur's own. A wave of disorientation washed over him. Identical, two boys, his breath hitched. The emptiness in his life, the gaping void of infertility, felt suddenly surmountable. A tremor of hope, fragile as spun glass, began to take root in the barren landscape of his soul. But beneath the burgeoning hope lay the chilling premonition of a truth too terrible, too unbelievable to comprehend. This necklace, this photograph, these secrets whispered from a forgotten past, held the potential to shatter the carefully constructed reality of his existence. And Arthur, in his lonely opulence, was about to unravel it all. The weight of the necklace felt strangely comforting, a tangible link to a past Arthur barely knew. He ran a finger along the cool silver, the intricate serpents seeming to writhe beneath his touch. The faded photograph, tucked within the hidden clasp, felt like a burning brand on his skin. Two identical boys. It couldn't be, could it? He spent the next few days in a feverish haze, the mansion's opulent silence broken only by the frantic scratching of his pen on parchment as he scoured dusty genealogical records, his fingers stained with ink. Each dead end, each cryptic clue, fueled the obsessive fire in his heart. The whispers of the past, once a distant echo, now screamed for attention. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford, the images of those twin boys haunting his dreams, their innocent eyes mirroring his own gnawing despair. One morning, sunlight slicing through the dusty gloom of his study, Arthur found himself staring at a yellowed newspaper clipping tucked inside an old family Bible. A small article, barely noticeable, described a tragic accident involving a young couple and their infant twins. The location, a remote village in the Cotswolds. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Could this be? The unsettling certainty propelled him into action. He picked up the phone, the polished mahogany cool beneath his trembling fingers. He needed help, someone objective, someone who could navigate the labyrinth of his family's secrets. He dialed a number, a name whispered to him by a hesitant colleague, a private investigator known for her discretion and sharp intellect. Isabella Rossi. "I need your help." Arthur's voice was strained, a stark contrast to his usual controlled tone. "It's complicated." Isabella's voice, calm and measured, reassured him. "Tell me everything, Mr. Cavendish." And so, over the next few hours, he poured out his story, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and burgeoning hope. The luxury of his mansion suddenly felt suffocating, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had to uncover the truth. He had to know. The fate of his heart, his identity, his very future hinged on it. The ancient necklace, once a symbol of his loneliness, had become his beacon of hope, a thread pulling him towards an uncertain but undeniably compelling future. The weight of the past and the potential for a different future felt equally heavy. The Cotswolds. The name itself whispered secrets, a rustle of leaves in an ancient wood. Arthur, his face pale beneath the harsh glare of the airplane window, felt a tremor of anticipation, a mixture of dread and desperate hope churning in his stomach. He clutched the necklace, its cool weight a constant reminder of the journey he'd embarked upon. The faded photograph, two identical boys grinning mischievously, felt burned into his memory. The village, nestled in a valley, seemed untouched by time. Stone cottages huddled together like gossiping neighbors, their roofs heavy with moss and age. A chill wind carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Isabella, sitting beside him, her gaze sharp and observant, broke the silence. "Nervous?" she asked, her voice a low murmur against the drone of the engine. "Terrified," Arthur admitted, his voice a raspy whisper, "and yet hopeful." He glanced at the photograph again, the image blurring with his unshed tears. The thought of a brother, a twin, a life lived parallel to his own, was almost too much to bear. They arrived at a small, ivy-covered cottage. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by time and hardship, opened the door. Her eyes, the color of faded amber, held a depth of wisdom that seemed to pierce Arthur's soul. "You are Arthur Cavendish," she stated, her voice surprisingly strong, devoid of greeting. Arthur nodded, speechless, the weight of his family's hidden history pressing down on him. The old woman, Mrs. Albright, led them inside, the air thick with the scent of lavender and beeswax. The room was sparsely furnished, yet filled with a palpable sense of history, of secrets whispered through generations. "Your parents, they were good people," Mrs. Albright said, her voice softening slightly, "but burdened by a sorrow they could not bear." Arthur felt a surge of anger, a bitter taste rising in his throat. "What sorrow? What burden?" he demanded, his voice tight with suppressed rage. The years of loneliness, the aching emptiness of his childless marriage, all coalesced into a raw, desperate need for answers. Mrs. Albright sighed, her gaze distant, lost in the mists of memory. "They loved you both," she said, finally, her voice barely a breath. "But the circumstances, they were difficult." The silence that followed hung heavy, pregnant with unspoken truths, with the ghosts of a past Arthur was only beginning to glimpse. The weight of the necklace, the faded photograph, the journey to this remote village, all pointed towards a truth that would forever alter his perception of himself, his family, and the very meaning of inheritance. The revelation hung in the air, a promise and a threat, as thick and heavy as the Cotswold mist outside. The cottage interior was a stark contrast to Arthur's opulent mansion. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon sunlight slicing through the grimy windowpane. The air, thick with the scent of lavender and wood smoke, held a comforting warmth that belied the chill outside. Mrs. Albright's words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Arthur felt the familiar sting of tears behind his eyes, a desperate longing to finally understand the mystery of his life. He ran a trembling hand over the cool smoothness of the necklace, its weight a tangible link to the past. "Difficult?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, raw with years of suppressed frustration. "What kind of difficult? My parents died, unexplained. My wife, unable to conceive. Was this the difficult part?" He gestured wildly at the necklace, his voice rising in pitch. Isabella placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Arthur," she murmured, her voice calm and soothing amidst his rising agitation. "Let her explain. We need to hear everything." Mrs. Albright's gaze softened, a flicker of empathy in her amber eyes. She picked up a chipped teacup, her gnarled fingers tracing its rim. "Your parents, they were blessed, Arthur. Doubly blessed." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But the circumstances of your birth, they were not easy. A secret, a burden they carried for years." The old woman's voice trembled slightly. The silence that followed felt thick, a suffocating blanket woven from years of secrets. Arthur felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. His breath hitched. "A secret?" he repeated, his voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock in the corner. The rhythmic tick-tock echoed his own racing heartbeat. "What secret? What about my brother?" The question hung in the air, a fragile hope desperately clinging to the possibility of truth. He could feel the anticipation thrumming through his body, a mixture of fear and exhilaration, a dizzying cocktail of emotion. The faded photograph of two identical boys, their smiles mirrored, their eyes full of light, seared itself into his mind. Mrs. Albright looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. The necklace, it was a promise, a reminder, a testament to the love they could not fully express. Her voice was barely a whisper, the weight of years pressing down on her. "But the truth is a tangled thread, Arthur. Unraveling it will be painful." She shifted, her gaze falling upon the worn, wooden floorboards. The silence stretched, taut with unspoken words, pregnant with the weight of generations of secrets, waiting to be revealed. The scent of lavender suddenly felt cloying, heavy, a shroud of mystery enveloping them. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, bracing himself for the truth, whatever form it might take. The weight of the necklace, suddenly, felt heavier, a tangible symbol of his family's hidden past. The old woman's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. Arthur felt the chill of the cottage seep into his bones, a stark contrast to the opulent warmth of his mansion. He traced the intricate carvings on the necklace, the cool silver a stark contrast to the burning anxiety in his chest. The faded photograph, two smiling boys, felt like a phantom limb, a missing piece of himself he never knew existed. "Doubly blessed," he repeated, the words catching in his throat. "But separated?" His voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible above the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock. The sound echoed the frantic beat of his heart. Isabella squeezed his arm, her touch a grounding presence in the swirling vortex of his emotions. "Let her explain, Arthur," she urged, her voice soft but firm. She understood the desperate yearning in his eyes, the years of unanswered questions finally surfacing. Mrs. Albright sighed, a sound like wind rustling through dry leaves. "Your parents, they loved you both fiercely, but circumstances, they forced a terrible choice." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the memories of a past she couldn't quite escape. The air grew thick with anticipation. Arthur's breath hitched, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning hope. The cottage, once comforting, now felt suffocating, the scent of lavender turning cloying, heavy like a shroud. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of unspoken truths. "A choice," Arthur repeated, his voice strained. "What choice? Why was I kept in the dark?" His voice rose, cracking with a raw, desperate urgency. The years of loneliness, the emptiness that had gnawed at him, were finally erupting, a volcanic eruption of suppressed emotions. Mrs. Albright's gaze fell upon the worn floorboards, avoiding his eyes. "There was illness," she whispered, her voice laced with sorrow. "Your mother, she was very ill after giving birth. Only one child could be cared for. It was a heartbreaking decision." The words hung suspended in the silence, their terrible implications slowly sinking in. Arthur felt a cold dread crawl up his spine, a sickening realization slowly dawning. The weight of the necklace suddenly felt crushing, the symbol of a cruel choice, a hidden pain, the possibility of a different life, a different family, shattered against the harsh reality of his parents' impossible decision. The truth, it seemed, was more painful than any uncertainty. The silence in the cottage pressed down on Arthur, thick and suffocating. Dust motes danced in the lone shaft of sunlight slicing through the grime-coated windowpane. The scent of lavender, once comforting, now felt cloying, a morbid perfume masking the undercurrent of grief. He stared at the faded photograph clutched in his hand. The two identical boys, a ghostly echo of a life he'd never known. Illness, he repeated, his voice a harsh rasp against the quiet. The word felt inadequate, a flimsy excuse for the gaping hole in his life. He looked at Isabella, her face etched with a sympathetic understanding that both soothed and infuriated him. Why hadn't anyone told him? Mrs. Albright, her face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by time and sorrow, nodded slowly. Your mother, she was frail. The doctors, they warned. Her voice trailed off, choked with emotion. The weight of her unspoken words hung heavier than the ancient necklace around Arthur's neck. He felt a surge of anger, hot and bitter, rising in his throat. Anger at his parents, at the cruel hand of fate, at the silence that had enveloped his life for so long. The years of loneliness, the hollow ache in his heart. It all coalesced into a furious tempest threatening to consume him. Only one, he whispered, the question laced with disbelief and a raw, wounded pain. The opulent emptiness of his mansion suddenly felt less like a choice and more like a cruel consequence. He pictured his childhood, the echoing halls, the distant servants, the chilling absence of a brother. The luxury had been a gilded cage. Isabella reached out, her hand covering his, a silent offering of comfort. Her touch, gentle yet firm, anchored him to the present, a lifeline in the swirling vortex of his emotions. He squeezed her hand, the pressure a silent acknowledgement of the shared weight of this revelation. Mrs. Albright continued, her voice barely a breath. The decision, it tore your parents apart. Your father, he never truly recovered. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound sadness that mirrored the storm raging within him. The photograph felt like a burning brand, a constant reminder of a stolen past, a brother lost. The necklace, a symbol of inheritance, suddenly felt like a shackle. The truth, brutal and raw, was beginning to surface, and it was far more devastating than any carefully constructed fantasy. The cottage air, thick with the scent of lavender and dust, felt heavy on Arthur's chest. He clutched the faded photograph, the two identical boys staring back at him like ghosts from a forgotten life. Mrs. Albright's words hung in the suffocating silence. Illness? Your mother, frail. The explanation felt flimsy, a cruel curtain drawn over a deeper, more agonizing truth. Only one survived, he repeated, his voice a raw whisper, the question laced with disbelief and a profound, gut-wrenching pain. The opulent emptiness of his mansion, once a symbol of success, now felt like a gilded cage, a testament to his profound loneliness. Isabella's hand, warm and comforting on his, was the only anchor in the storm raging within him. He squeezed her hand, the pressure a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden, of the weight of this devastating revelation. He felt a surge of anger, a hot, bitter tide threatening to consume him. Anger at his parents, at the cruel twist of fate, at the suffocating silence that had defined his life. Mrs. Albright's voice, frail and trembling, broke the silence. The decision, it tore your parents apart. Your father, he never truly recovered. Her eyes, filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own, held a lifetime of unspoken grief. The years of loneliness, the aching emptiness, the unanswered questions, it all converged, a crushing weight threatening to suffocate him. He pictured his childhood, the vast, echoing halls of his mansion, the distant, almost invisible servants, the chilling absence of a brother. The luxury had been a cruel mockery, a gilded cage built around a heart starved for connection. The photograph burned in his hand, a constant reminder of a stolen past, a brother lost to illness, to a decision made in the shadows of grief and desperation. The ancient necklace, once a treasured heirloom, now felt like a heavy chain, a symbol of inheritance burdened with a devastating secret. The truth, raw and brutal, was slowly surfacing, and it was far more devastating than any carefully constructed fantasy could ever have been. He felt a shudder, a physical manifestation of the grief that was finally, painfully allowed to surface. The weight of unspoken words, of lost years, of a life lived in the shadow of a devastating secret, settled heavily upon his shoulders. The journey had only just begun. The drive back was silent, punctuated only by the rhythmic thump of tires on the asphalt. The lavender scent of Mrs. Albright's cottage clung to Arthur like a shroud, a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive fragrance of his car's interior. Isabella reached out, her hand covering his, a silent offering of comfort. He squeezed her fingers, the pressure a silent acknowledgement of the shared weight of their discovery. "Illness so vague," he finally murmured, his voice rough with unshed tears. The word felt inadequate, a pale imitation of the vast chasm of loss that had suddenly opened before him. He envisioned his childhood, a series of empty rooms and fleeting encounters, the absence of a brother now a gaping wound in his past. Isabella's gaze was understanding, her silence more comforting than any platitude. "It's a starting point, Arthur," she said softly, her voice a soothing balm against the raw edges of his grief. "We'll find out more. We'll uncover the truth." He stared out the window, the blurring landscape mirroring the chaos within him. The ancient necklace, heavy in his pocket, felt like a physical manifestation of his burden. He'd been so consumed by the emptiness of his life, by the ache of childlessness. He hadn't considered this, the gaping hole where a brother should have been. The opulent mansion, once a symbol of success, now felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a life lived in isolation. "My parents," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They kept this from me." The accusation wasn't directed at Isabella, but at the ghosts of his parents, at the years of carefully constructed lies. He pictured their faces, vague and distant memories, and felt a surge of anger, a hot, bitter tide threatening to consume him. Isabella's hand tightened on his. "Maybe it wasn't easy for them, Arthur. Maybe they were protecting you in their own way." He wasn't convinced. The thought offered little solace. The truth felt far more cruel, far more devastating than any carefully constructed fantasy. The luxury he'd surrounded himself with, the carefully curated life, now felt utterly hollow, a fragile facade built upon a foundation of lies. The weight of his loneliness, amplified by this newfound, agonizing knowledge, felt almost unbearable. The journey had begun, but the path ahead was shrouded in darkness, filled with uncertainty, and punctuated by the searing pain of a life lived in a self-imposed exile, a life utterly redefined by the presence and absence of a brother. The necklace, now more than an heirloom, felt like a shackle, binding him to a past he only now began to comprehend. The photograph, brittle with age, depicted two boys, mirror images of each other, beaming at the camera. Their laughter seemed to echo faintly from the sepia tones, a ghostly sound only Arthur could hear. He traced the outline of one boy's face, his own mirrored back at him, a chilling reflection of a life he never knew. The hidden compartment, sprung open with a delicate click, felt like a betrayal, a secret whispered only to him now. The weight of the necklace, cool against his skin, suddenly felt heavier, laden with unspoken years, untold stories. He clutched the photograph, the paper crackling like dry leaves under his trembling fingers. His opulent study, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt claustrophobic, the heavy drapes and mahogany furniture pressing in on him. The fire in the hearth crackled, a muted counterpoint to the storm raging within him. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the fine lines etched around his eyes, lines born not of age, but of a profound, lifelong loneliness. "Two boys," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Identical my parents, why?" The question hung unanswered, a gaping hole in the tapestry of his life. He felt a dizzying sense of disorientation, a nauseating blend of excitement and fear. The meticulously curated facade of his life, the wealth, the success, the solitude crumbled before him, revealing a foundation of carefully constructed lies. This wasn't just about a lost heirloom. It was about a lost identity. He rose, pacing the length of his study, the Persian rug soft beneath his feet, yet offering no comfort. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of a grandfather clock, a stern, unfamiliar face etched with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second a hammer blow against the fragile structure of his carefully constructed reality. He needed answers. He had to find answers. The quest had begun, a journey into the shadowed corners of his past, a search for a brother he never knew, and a truth he desperately needed to uncover. The necklace, once a symbol of his family's legacy, was now his map to a new and terrifying future. The photograph felt like a brand. Arthur's fingertips, calloused despite a life of luxury, traced the identical grins, the matching cowlicks. He'd spent years cultivating an emotional barrenness, a fortress against the pain of his childlessness. Now, this image, this impossible echo, shattered the carefully constructed walls. The heavy silence of his study pressed down, the scent of old leather and expensive wood suddenly suffocating. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the movement a tremor of anxiety. The fire, once a comforting beacon, now felt like a malevolent eye, watching him unravel. "Two boys," he murmured again, the words catching in his throat. His reflection in the polished mahogany desk, a man etched with the loneliness of decades, offered no solace. The necklace, cool against his skin, pulsed with a strange energy. It wasn't just precious metal. It was a conduit to a past he'd never known, a past that defied everything he believed. He felt a dizzying rush of possibilities, terrifying in their implications. What if this wasn't just a forgotten family heirloom? What if it was a key to unlocking a hidden life, a secret brother, a truth that could rewrite his entire existence? He rose, pacing the length of his vast study. The Persian rug, usually a comforting softness beneath his feet, felt alien, cold. The weight of his solitude, once a familiar burden, now felt amplified, unbearable. He thought of his wife, Eleanor. Their marriage, a gilded cage of polite conversation and carefully maintained distance. Had she known? Could she have known? The thought was a bitter pill, leaving a taste of betrayal on his tongue. The investigation, he realized, wasn't just a quest for answers. It was a desperate search for a connection, for a missing piece of himself. He picked up the telephone, the polished black surface gleaming under the firelight. He punched in a number, his finger trembling slightly as he placed the receiver to his ear. The ringing was a stark counterpoint to the turmoil within him. It was time to face the truth, however painful, however terrifying it may be. He needed help, and he knew just who to call. The phone's insistent ring sliced through the suffocating silence. Arthur flinched, the jarring sound a physical blow. He stared at the photograph again, the two boys' identical smiles mocking his solitude. He picked up the receiver, his hand shaking. "Hello?" he managed, his voice a strained whisper. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Mr. Ainsworth? This is Isabella Rossi. We spoke earlier." Relief, sharp and sudden, pierced the anxiety. "Ms. Rossi," he breathed, the sound oddly comforting. I need to meet with you. Tonight." "Tonight?" A slight pause. "Certainly, Mr. Ainsworth. Where would you prefer?" He glanced at the opulent study, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. The scene felt too heavy, too laden with the weight of his secret. My club, the Blackwood, private room, 11 o'clock. Excellent. I will be there." The line clicked, leaving Arthur alone with the photograph and the gnawing uncertainty. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of the fear and hope battling within. The weight of the necklace, normally a comforting presence, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of the impossible truth he was about to confront. He ran a hand over the cool metal, its intricate carvings suddenly feeling alien, sharp against his skin. The fire crackled, a counterpoint to the chaotic rhythm of his heartbeat. He was stepping onto a path with no guarantee of return, a path into the unknown, a path that might lead to the answers he desperately craved, or to even greater despair. The thought spurred him into action. He needed to prepare, to steel himself for whatever revelations lay ahead. He had spent a lifetime building walls around his heart. Now he was about to tear them down. The Blackwood Club hummed with a low, sophisticated thrum. Crystal glasses clinked. The murmur of conversation, a silken backdrop to the clinking ice and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Arthur, however, felt none of the usual comfort. The private room, usually a sanctuary, felt like a cage. He nervously adjusted the ancient necklace, the cool silver a stark contrast to the clammy heat of his palm. He could almost taste the metallic tang of fear. The door opened, and Isabella Rossi entered. She was even more striking in person, sharp eyes that missed nothing, a quiet confidence radiating from her. She wore a tailored suit that spoke of efficiency, yet her smile held a warmth that softened the professional facade. "Mr. Ainsworth," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of his pulse. "You look troubled." Arthur managed a weak smile. "Troubled is an understatement, Ms. Rossi. This photograph," he gestured towards the faded image on the table, "it's changed everything." He explained his discovery, the hidden compartment, the identical boys. Isabella listened intently, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to focused attention. The scent of her perfume, something subtly floral and sophisticated, filled the air, a strange comfort in the suffocating anxiety. "Two identical boys," she murmured, tracing a finger along the edge of the photograph. "And this necklace, it's incredibly old. Its craftsmanship suggests a lineage far more significant than I initially imagined." Her voice held a low hum of excitement, a stark contrast to Arthur's internal turmoil. "I need to know," Arthur said, his voice raw with desperation. "I need to know who they are." The weight of years of unanswered questions, of a life lived in quiet despair, pressed down on him. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, a dull throb of loneliness that had become a constant companion. Isabella nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I have reason to believe we're dealing with something far older, far more complex than initially suspected. And I suspect the answers lie far beyond the city limits." The cool certainty in her voice was a lifeline in the churning storm of his emotions. He knew, instinctively, that he was placing his entire life, his carefully constructed world, in her capable hands. The weight of that realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The game had begun, and he was ready, however terrifying the end might be. The scent of old paper and dust clung to the air in the dusty attic room of the Blackwood Manor. Arthur traced the faded inscription on the necklace's clasp, the cool silver a stark contrast to the trembling in his hands. He felt a profound sense of unease, a creeping dread that snaked its way through his usually calm demeanor. The photograph, tucked inside the hidden compartment, showed two cherubic boys, their faces identical, yet their expressions worlds apart. One beamed, a carefree laugh implied in the upward tilt of his mouth. The other wore a shadow of sadness, a wistful gaze that mirrored the emptiness in Arthur's own heart. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the movement a nervous tick. The initial shock had given way to a gnawing obsession. The library, usually a haven of quiet contemplation, now felt like a battlefield, littered with discarded books and research notes. Each dead end only fueled his desperate search for answers, the silence of the vast rooms amplifying the frantic rhythm of his pulse. He muttered to himself, the words a low hum of frustration, a prayer whispered into the echoing emptiness. He consulted genealogical records, his fingers stained with the residue of aged parchment. He'd plumbed the depths of family archives, his frustration mounting with each cryptic clue. The mention of a midwife named Alara, residing in a remote village in the Cotswolds, was the only real lead, a tantalizing breadcrumb in a maze of dead ends. He found himself staring out the tall, arched windows of his study, the sprawling gardens of Blackwood Manor a muted backdrop to his inner turmoil. The once pristine lawns now seemed overgrown and neglected, mirroring the state of his own soul. The weight of his childlessness pressed down on him, a crushing weight amplified by the discovery of the photograph. Had he been robbed of something else all along? Had the emptiness he felt been more profound, more deliberately engineered than he'd ever imagined? The thought sent a fresh wave of icy fear through him. He clutched the necklace tighter, the cold silver a small comfort in the overwhelming storm of his emotions. The weight of his quest for answers was immense, the potential truth, both terrifying and intoxicating. The game was far from over. It had only just begun. The Cotswolds village of Ashton was a postcard come to life, honey-colored stone cottages, overflowing flower boxes, and the gentle murmur of a stream threading through the heart of it. But for Arthur, the picturesque scene offered little solace. The biting wind whipped at his expensive coat, a stark contrast to the controlled environment of Blackwood Manor. He clutched the ancient necklace, its cool weight a constant reminder of his obsessive quest. His touch, the scent of old wood and dust hung heavy in the air, mingling with a faint, almost imperceptible trace of something else, lavender, perhaps, a ghost of a long-forgotten perfume. I don't know what to expect," he confessed, his voice cracking. The years of carefully constructed emotional walls crumbled, revealing a raw vulnerability. Isabella placed a comforting hand on his arm. Her touch was a lifeline in the suffocating silence of the house. "We'll find answers, Arthur," she said softly, her voice a balm to his wounded spirit. Together, her words, though simple, offered a fragile hope, a promise of shared discovery in the face of daunting uncertainty. The weight of the secret, the potential for further heartbreak, hung heavy in the air, but in Isabella's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own desperate yearning for connection, a shared understanding that transcended the chilling atmosphere of Oakhaven Manor. The search for a brother had become a search for himself, for a lost piece of his identity, buried deep within the shadowed corners of a family history shrouded in secrecy. The journey had only just begun. The old woman, Alara, lived in a cottage choked by climbing roses, their scent thick and sweet, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of Arthur's mansion. He sat opposite her, the worn wooden table between them feeling strangely comforting amidst the chaos in his head. Alara's eyes, the color of faded denim, held a lifetime of secrets. "Your parents, they loved you both," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sorrow. Arthur flinched. "Loved us, but they separated us." The accusation, though directed at his parents, felt like a self-recrimination. The years of loneliness, the emptiness that had haunted his life, all pointed back to that singular act of separation. Alara nodded, her gaze drifting to the chipped teacup in her hands. The necklace, it was a promise, a bond they couldn't break, even when they tried to bury it. She looked at him directly, her eyes unwavering. "They believed it was for the best, that one of you needed to be protected." Protected from what? The question hung unanswered, a phantom limb of his past. The weight of this revelation pressed down on him, a physical burden. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, a precursor to the anxiety that threatened to consume him. The idyllic setting of the cottage, once soothing, now felt suffocating. "Protected," Arthur repeated, his voice barely a breath. The word felt inadequate, a flimsy shield against the enormity of what he was learning. The image of the photograph of two identical boys flashed in his mind, a jarring interruption to the peaceful scene. He saw himself mirrored, a life he had never lived. Alara sighed, the sound like the rustling of dry leaves. "Your mother," she feared for Elias, for his safety. "Your father, he made the impossible choice." She paused, the silence heavy with unshed tears. "The necklace, it was their way of ensuring you'd find each other, eventually." The faintest hint of hope threaded through her words, a fragile thread of light in the deepening shadows of his past. The ancient necklace, a symbol of both division and connection, lay heavy on the table between them. It was a physical manifestation of the family's impossible choice, a bittersweet testament to a love that had been both fiercely protective and deeply flawed. The cottage's scent, once comforting, now felt cloying, the sweetness a mockery of the bitter truth. Arthur's hands trembled as he picked up the necklace, its cool metal a stark contrast to the burning anger that coursed through him. "Protected?" he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "From what? Why couldn't they just tell me?" Alara's sigh was a whisper of wind through dry leaves. "Your father, he believed a powerful enemy targeted your family. He feared for Elias's life." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the labyrinth of memories. "Your mother?" She couldn't bear the thought of losing another child. The weight of this explanation pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket woven from years of deceit and unspoken fears. Relief warred with rage. Finding Elias was supposed to bring solace, but this revelation felt like a fresh wound, ripped open and cruelly exposed. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. An enemy? Arthur's voice was raw, strained with disbelief. Who? What kind of enemy would target a child? Alara's eyes, pools of weathered wisdom, held a sadness that mirrored his own. Your father never spoke openly of it, only hinted at a shadow from the past, a debt unpaid. She picked up a chipped teacup, the porcelain cold against her fingers. The separation was his desperate attempt to protect Elias. He believed by hiding him, keeping him away from the family's opulent life, he would keep him safe. Arthur stared at the necklace, the intricate carvings suddenly seeming menacing, a symbol not of heritage, but of a carefully constructed lie. He felt a surge of resentment, not just towards his parents, but towards himself for his naive belief in his barren life. This infertility, once a source of profound sadness, now felt like another cruel twist of fate, a testament to his family's twisted legacy. The relief of finding his twin was overshadowed by the bitter knowledge of his stolen identity, a life lived in a gilded cage of deception. The anger simmered, a dangerous heat threatening to boil over. The quiet cottage, once a sanctuary of revelation, felt like a prison. The roses outside, once sweet, now seemed to mock him with their innocent beauty. The cottage air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, did little to soothe Arthur's turmoil. Alara's words hung heavy, each syllable a tiny weight pressing down on his already burdened soul. He ran a hand through his hair, the strands stiff with the day's anxieties. The necklace, cold and heavy in his palm, felt like a shackle rather than an heirloom. A debt unpaid, he murmured, the phrase echoing the unsettling emptiness within him. The opulent silence of his mansion felt a million miles away, replaced by the suffocating quiet of the cottage. The roses outside, vibrant crimson against the gray stone, seemed to mock his internal tempest. Isabella, ever observant, sat quietly, her presence a calming anchor in the storm. She reached for his hand, her touch surprisingly strong and reassuring. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the raging tempest inside him. "This isn't the end. It's a beginning." He looked at her, the intensity of his gaze softened by a flicker of something akin to hope. Isabella's empathy was a lifeline in this sea of betrayal. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her unwavering support. "I feel lost," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I thought I knew, gone. My life, my identity, my very reason for being, all built on a lie." Isabella nodded, her understanding palpable. "But you have found something else," she pointed out, her voice steady. "A brother, a connection you never knew existed. That's a powerful truth, Arthur. Don't let the anger consume you." He considered her words, the weight of years of unspoken questions and unanswered longings slowly giving way to a fragile acceptance. The anger remained, a simmering volcano beneath the surface, but alongside it grew a tentative seedling of hope, nourished by Isabella's compassion and the revelation of his twin. He needed time to absorb the shock, to confront the years of deception, to rebuild the shattered fragments of his identity. But for now, Isabella's unwavering support and the faint possibility of a relationship with his brother provided a fragile, but crucial, foothold in the chaos. The necklace remained cold in his hand, a symbol of a past shrouded in secrecy, yet it also represented a new, uncertain future. The drive back to Arthur's mansion was silent, punctuated only by the rhythmic whisper of tires on asphalt. The scent of pine from the surrounding woods, sharp and clean, did little to cleanse the bitter taste of betrayal that lingered in Arthur's mouth. He stared out the window, the blurring landscape mirroring the chaos within him. Isabella's quiet presence beside him was a comforting contrast to the tempest raging inside. I don't know what to feel," Arthur finally confessed, his voice raspy. The admission felt raw, vulnerable. Isabella, ever perceptive, reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Anger is understandable, Arthur. Betrayal runs deep." He squeezed her hand, the pressure a silent testament to his turmoil. "But relief? I felt relief. Finding Elias, a brother, after all this time." The words felt strange, alien on his tongue. The sheer absurdity of it all threatened to overwhelm him. The weight of years of loneliness, of a life built on a foundation of lies, threatened to crush him. "It's a complex mix of emotions," Isabella said softly, her voice a calming balm on his raw nerves. "You've spent your life believing something fundamentally untrue. That's bound to shake you to your core." He nodded, the movement jerky, his body rigid with unspoken anxieties. The opulence of his mansion, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a gilded cage. Each meticulously crafted detail, the polished marble floors, the priceless artwork, mocked his inner emptiness. He imagined Elias's simple cottage, a stark contrast to this excessive display of wealth. The thought spurred a fresh wave of guilt. He seemed content, Arthur mumbled, the words barely audible. "A life so different from mine. And yet," he trailed off, searching for the right words to articulate the complex emotions swirling within him. The sense of shared heritage, the sudden kinship, warred with resentment and the lingering sting of deception. This newfound brother, this simple man who lived a life devoid of the gilded cage that had imprisoned Arthur, presented a mirror reflecting a reality Arthur had never known, and in the reflection, he saw a man he did not recognize. The weight of unspoken questions hung heavy in the air, a silent promise of the difficult conversations to come. The necklace, heavy in his pocket, felt less like an heirloom, and more like a testament to the lies that had shaped his life. The car pulled up to Arthur's mansion, the imposing structure looming against the twilight sky. The wrought iron gates, usually a symbol of impenetrable security, felt like bars now. Inside, the opulent emptiness pressed in on him. The polished marble floors reflected the flickering candlelight, highlighting the stark contrast between the physical grandeur and the emotional desolation. "This place, it feels different now," Arthur murmured, running a hand over the cool, smooth surface of a nearby statue. Isabella sat beside him, her gaze sharp and understanding. "Different how?" He sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken burdens. "Before, it was a sanctuary. Now, it feels like a mausoleum." He looked at the necklace, resting heavily in his palm, its cold weight a tangible reminder of the secrets it held. A mausoleum built on lies. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile piece. "Elias," Arthur began, his voice hoarse. He didn't seem resentful, not bitter, just resigned. "Perhaps he's had time to process his own feelings," Isabella offered gently. "It's been a lifetime of separation." Arthur nodded slowly, tracing the intricate carvings on the necklace. The faded photograph of two identical boys, now clutched tightly in his other hand, felt like a physical manifestation of his shattered identity. "But what about my parents? Why keep this from me? Why keep us apart?" His voice cracked with unshed tears. The anger he'd felt earlier was now overshadowed by a crushing wave of grief and betrayal. The weight of his parents' actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of unspoken words and missed opportunities. He pictured his childhood, a lonely landscape devoid of the familial warmth he had craved. Isabella squeezed his hand again, offering silent support. "Finding answers may bring you some peace, Arthur, but finding peace with the past takes time." Her words were a balm, a comforting presence in the overwhelming storm of emotions engulfing him. He knew she was right, yet the questions gnawed at him, leaving him restless, uncertain, and deeply hurt. The revelation of his twin had cracked open the foundation of his life, revealing the precariousness of his carefully constructed world, a world built upon a lie. The journey to healing, he knew, was just beginning. The dusty road wound its way through the rolling hills, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the air. Arthur's rented car bumped along, the jarring rhythm mirroring the unease in his chest. He glanced at Elias's address, scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. A small cottage, nestled at the edge of a forgotten village. He'd imagined a grand reunion, a dramatic confrontation. Instead, he felt a rising tide of trepidation. Elias's cottage was smaller than Arthur had anticipated. A humble dwelling painted a faded blue. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a wisp of domesticity against the stark landscape. Taking a deep breath, Arthur approached, the gravel crunching under his shoes. A weathered wooden door, slightly ajar, revealed a glimpse of a cozy interior. Hesitantly, he knocked. The sound echoed in the quiet afternoon. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a man who was his mirror image, yet utterly different. Elias. His clothes were simple, his face etched with the lines of a life lived far from Arthur's gilded cage. He looked at Arthur with a mixture of surprise and, was it apprehension? "Arthur." Elias's voice was quiet, a low rumble that held a hint of uncertainty. "Elias," Arthur replied, his voice barely a whisper. The years melted away, the chasm of their separate lives momentarily forgotten in the face of undeniable resemblance. Their eyes locked, a silent acknowledgement of a shared history, a lifetime of missed connection. The air hung heavy with unspoken words, a poignant symphony of what might have been. The ancient necklace, nestled in Arthur's pocket, felt suddenly heavy with the weight of their shared legacy. He pulled it out. This is why I'm here." Elias's gaze fell on the necklace, his expression unreadable. A moment stretched, filled only with the rustling of leaves and the distant cry of a bird. The silence, however, was not empty. It resonated with unspoken grief, unanswered questions, and the quiet desperation of two lives diverging on a path they never chose. The weight of their shared past hung between them, a tangible barrier as thick as the years that separated them. The reunion, Arthur realized, was only the beginning of a long, and perhaps painful, journey. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and something subtly sweet, perhaps apples simmering on the stove. Elias's kitchen was small, cluttered with worn cookware and mismatched mugs. Sunlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur, still clutching the necklace, felt a tremor of nervousness. This wasn't the opulent setting he'd envisioned for this reunion. It was humble, honest. Elias, his twin, offered a hesitant smile, a mirror image slightly cracked by time and hardship. "Come in," he murmured, his voice rougher than Arthur remembered, or perhaps had ever known. The silence that followed was thick, weighted by years of separation, a chasm bridged only by their identical features. I found this," Arthur said finally, his voice cracking slightly as he extended the necklace. The ancient metal gleamed faintly in the dim light. Elias's eyes flickered over the intricate design, a flicker of recognition, then a shadow of pain. He took the necklace gently, his fingers tracing the worn metal. "Our grandmothers," he whispered, his gaze distant, lost in memories Arthur couldn't share. She never spoke of you," Arthur confessed, the words tumbling out, raw and vulnerable. "Of us. The years of unanswered questions, of a hollow ache in his heart, finally found voice. Elias sighed, a sound heavy with regret. He looked up, his eyes meeting Arthur's. "Our parents, they had reasons," he said, his voice strained. "Reasons they couldn't tell us, not then." A log shifted in the hearth, spitting a shower of sparks. The sudden noise broke the spell of shared sorrow. Arthur felt the weight of his own anger, years of bitterness bubbling to the surface. Reasons? They stole my brother. They stole my past. The words were sharp, laced with resentment. The comfortable illusion of his perfect life shattered, leaving him raw and exposed. Elias didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I know," he said quietly, "and I've spent my whole life wondering why." He paused, a deep breath escaping his lips. "But maybe," he continued, a faint hope flickering in his eyes, "maybe it's not too late to understand." The air hung heavy with unspoken words, with the potential for healing, for a connection forged in shared loss and the promise of a future built on finally knowing the truth. The necklace, lying between them, seemed to pulse with a silent promise. The cottage air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and apples, felt strangely comforting to Arthur, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his mansion. He watched Elias, a mirror image subtly altered by years of sun and hardship, his brother's face etched with a quiet weariness. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken accusations and the ghost of shared childhoods. "Our grandmothers," Elias repeated, his voice raspy, a low tremor in his tone. He turned the necklace over in his hands, the ancient metal cool against his skin. She never mentioned you." Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat making speech difficult. "They never mentioned you. Anything." The years of carefully constructed solitude, the emptiness he'd filled with wealth and possessions, crumbled before the raw, unfiltered reality of his twin brother. The fire crackled, a sharp snap that punctuated the silence. Elias looked up, his eyes meeting Arthur's, a profound sadness in their depths that mirrored Arthur's own. "Our parents, they made choices," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "Difficult choices, choices born of fear." Arthur's anger, a simmering volcano beneath years of controlled composure, threatened to erupt. "Fear? They stole my brother. They stole my life." His voice was harsh, laced with the bitter sting of betrayal. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the pain of a life lived in a carefully constructed lie. Elias flinched, the slightest movement betraying years of suppressed emotion. "I know," he said softly, his gaze unwavering, "and I've spent my life wondering why, wondering if it was my fault." The weight of their parents' actions pressed down on them, suffocating. The small cottage, suddenly too small, could not contain the immensity of their shared pain. A bitter taste filled Arthur's mouth, a taste of resentment, of loss, of a stolen inheritance far greater than any ancient necklace. The silence returned, punctuated only by the gentle crackle of the fire and the rhythmic tick-tock of a nearby clock. It was a silence heavy with unspoken years, yet pregnant with the fragile possibility of something new. A shared truth, a shared pain, a shared future yet to be built. The necklace, lying between them, felt not like a symbol of division, but a fragile bridge. The cottage, small and smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp earth, felt utterly alien to Arthur. He shifted uncomfortably on the worn wooden chair, the rough surface a stark contrast to the silk and velvet of his usual surroundings. Elias, his twin, sat opposite, his hands clasped tightly around the ancient necklace. The fire cast flickering shadows on their faces, highlighting the subtle differences. The lines etched deeper around Elias's eyes, the sun-weathered skin on his hands, a quiet strength in his posture that Arthur lacked. "It's beautiful," Arthur said finally, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He reached for the necklace, but hesitated, the weight of years of separation, of lies, heavy between them. Elias didn't meet his gaze. He traced the intricate carvings on the pendant, his thumb lingering on a worn, almost invisible inscription. Grandmother. She always said it held the family's secrets. His voice was low, almost a whisper, the words thick with unspoken emotions. The silence stretched, a tangible thing, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the ticking grandfather clock in the corner. The air thrummed with a tension so thick, Arthur could almost taste it. He looked at his brother, really looked at him, at the lines of hardship etched onto his face, and a wave of guilt washed over him. His anger, the simmering resentment, began to recede, replaced by a raw ache of something else. Regret, loneliness, a yearning for a connection he'd never known. Secrets? Arthur echoed, his voice barely above a breath. The word hung between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken years. He thought of the sterile perfection of his mansion, the carefully curated loneliness, and the hollow echo of his supposed infertility. All of it felt insignificant now, dwarfed by the enormity of this discovery, this unexpected brother. He saw in Elias's eyes the same unspoken questions, the same profound sadness. This wasn't just about a necklace or a hidden history. It was about a life stolen, a brotherhood denied, a family fractured beyond repair. The firelight danced in Elias's eyes, reflecting a pain that mirrored his own. In that shared gaze, across the chasm of years and divergent lives, Arthur saw the glimmer of something fragile, something precious, the possibility of reconciliation. The old woman's words, raspy and laced with the scent of wood smoke and lavender, echoed in Arthur's mind. The storm separated them, the necklace, a promise. He stared at the flickering candlelight, its warm glow illuminating the faded photograph clutched in his hand, two identical boys, mirroring his own face, beaming with a carefree joy he'd never known. The cottage, small and cramped, felt a universe away from his sterile mansion. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful symphony mirroring the turmoil within him. He traced the lines of the photograph, his fingertip lingering on the boy's grin, a grin that mirrored his own suppressed smile, a smile lost somewhere in the echoing halls of his lonely childhood. The memories, fragmented and painful, began to coalesce. A storm, a raging tempest, his parents' hushed whispers, a frantic escape, then nothing. A blank space where his past should have been, filled now with the ghost of a twin brother, a life he'd never lived. They chose. Elias's voice, low and gravelly, broke the silence. He sat hunched over a chipped mug, his eyes distant, reflecting the firelight like two pools of trapped embers. They chose to protect us in their own way, a way that shattered everything. Arthur felt a surge of anger, a hot, bitter resentment rising in his throat. Protect? By separating us? By leaving me to grow up alone, believing I was somehow broken? His voice cracked. The years of loneliness, of quiet desperation, poured out in a single, heartbroken sentence. Elias looked up, his gaze meeting Arthur's. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep weariness that mirrored his own exhaustion. They were scared, Arthur. Scared of the world, scared for us. The storm, it was more than just a storm. It was a symbol. He paused, his hand reaching for the necklace, tracing the worn inscription again. This was their way of keeping a promise, a piece of us together. The scent of wood smoke filled the air, thick and cloying, yet somehow comforting in its simplicity. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away, each tick a tiny hammer blow against the silence that stretched between them. The wind outside howled again, a mournful cry against the night, a testament to the storm that had divided them, the storm that had shaped their lives. But in that shared silence, in that shared pain, a fragile connection began to bloom, a tentative shoot pushing through the hardened ground of years of separation and loss. The necklace, their shared inheritance, lay on the table between them, a silent witness to a fractured past and a potential future. The cottage's air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and lavender, hung heavy between them. Elias's silence, a vast, echoing space, felt heavier than Arthur's own simmering anger. Outside, the wind howled, a relentless, mournful beast clawing at the small windows. Arthur felt the chill seep into his bones, a stark contrast to the opulent warmth of his mansion. He picked up the necklace, its cool metal a strange comfort against his trembling fingers. "A promise?" he repeated, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the wind's lament. He traced the intricate carvings, each delicate line a whisper of a past he was only beginning to understand. "What promise?" Elias shifted, the firelight catching the lines etched on his weathered face. "A promise to find each other," he said, his voice rough, like the bark of an ancient tree. A promise whispered on the wind, carried across the years. Arthur stared at him, his heart a trapped bird fluttering against his ribs. He saw his own reflection in Elias's tired eyes, a ghost of the carefree boy in the photograph, a boy untouched by the cold loneliness that had shaped Arthur's life. "And what happened to that promise?" Arthur asked, his voice laced with a bitterness he couldn't quite control. He saw the hurt flicker across Elias's face, a fleeting shadow quickly masked by a practiced stoicism. "Life happened," Elias replied, his gaze drifting to the dying embers. "Circumstances, choices, they forced us apart. But the necklace, it was a lifeline, a thread connecting us across the miles, across the years." A silence descended, broken only by the frantic scratching of the wind against the cottage walls. Arthur felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, the weight of years of loneliness and unanswered questions pressing down. He looked at Elias, at the lines of hardship etched onto his brother's face, and a fragile understanding began to dawn. The anger began to subside, replaced by a raw, aching empathy. The storm, he realized, had not only separated them, but had shaped them, forging them into the men they were today. The necklace, a symbol of a broken promise, was also, perhaps, a symbol of a promise yet to be fulfilled. The promise of a connection, a brotherhood, forged in the crucible of a shared past and the hope of a shared future. The flickering firelight painted Elias's face in shifting shades of orange and shadow, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of hardship. The cottage, small and snug, felt suffocating with the weight of unspoken words. Arthur, accustomed to the spacious elegance of his mansion, felt a prickling unease in the confined space. The scent of wood smoke and lavender, initially comforting, now felt heavy, cloying. "So, the necklace," Arthur began, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. He ran a thumb over the cool metal, the intricate carvings a stark contrast to the raw emotions swirling within him. "It wasn't just a trinket, it was a map." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. "More like a lifeline," he corrected, his voice low and hesitant. "Our parents, they believed in a future where we'd find each other. They hoped." His voice trailed off, choked with unshed tears. Arthur saw the pain in his brother's eyes, a mirror reflecting his own years of loneliness. The anger that had fueled his search began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sadness. He imagined the desperation of his parents, their agonizing choices, the weight of their secret crushing them. The opulent emptiness of his life, once a source of pride, now felt like a cruel joke. "They never told me," Arthur whispered, the words thick with a mixture of grief and accusation. "Why? Why keep us apart?" Elias looked up, his eyes filled with a complex mix of regret and sorrow. "Fear," he said simply. "Fear of what might happen if we stayed together. They thought they were protecting us from each other, from the world." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the unspoken history of their family, the years of separation woven into the fabric of their lives. The wind howled outside, a mournful symphony echoing the sorrow in their hearts. The small cottage, filled with the scent of wood smoke and lavender, became a vessel containing the echoes of a lost past and the fragile promise of a future yet to be written. The necklace, a symbol of their fractured past, lay between them, a tangible link to a truth both devastating and ultimately hopeful. The promise whispered on the wind, carried across the years, was finally within their reach. The old woman's words, delivered in a whisper raspy with age, echoed in Arthur's mind. He saw it then, in a flash of memory, not a single event, but a montage. A bustling hospital, the frantic faces of doctors, a stolen glance at two identical bassinets, the chilling finality of a whispered conversation overheard through a thin hospital curtain. The scent of antiseptic, sharp and acrid, still clung to the memory, a phantom smell that overlaid the comforting lavender of Elias's cottage. His parents' faces, young and strained, flickered before his eyes. The guilt etched onto his mother's features, the grim determination in his father's. Their love, a fractured, desperate thing, twisted by a choice made under duress, a choice that had cleaved his life in two. They hadn't wanted to separate them. The old woman had insisted. They'd been forced to, by forces beyond their control. They weren't selfish, Elias had said, his voice barely a murmur, his eyes fixed on the swirling smoke from his pipe. They loved us, both of us, more than anything. The image of the two identical babies, nestled in their respective cribs, now shattered Arthur's carefully constructed reality. He'd built a life on the absence of a brother, a life defined by its emptiness. Now, that emptiness felt different, not just the absence of a child, but the absence of a part of himself, a stolen half-life. But why? Arthur had finally managed to croak out, the question laced with years of unspoken resentment and pain. Why the secrecy? Why the necklace? Elias inhaled deeply, the smoke curling around his face like a shroud. It was a promise, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. A hope that someday, somehow, we'd find each other. A way to trace our connection across the years. A legacy left for us to discover. He paused, his eyes locking with Arthur's. They believed that someday, we could mend what they'd broken. The necklace, resting on the small wooden table between them, seemed to shimmer faintly in the firelight. A testament to a love both powerful and tragically flawed. A legacy of loss and hope, wrapped in silver and secrets. The cottage, small and smelling faintly of wood smoke and lavender, felt a world away from Arthur's sterile mansion. He watched Elias, his twin, meticulously pack a pipe, the slow, deliberate movements a stark contrast to Arthur's usual frenetic energy. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. But the warmth of the flames couldn't quite reach the chill that settled between the brothers. So, Arthur began, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. The necklace? It was a promise? Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers. My mother. She always said it held a piece of our shared soul. Tether, she called it. A way to find each other, even across miles and years. He paused, a tremor in his voice. She believed in miracles, even when things seemed hopeless. Arthur felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Regret? Longing? He'd spent his life surrounded by luxury, yet he'd never felt truly connected to anything. This man, this simple man with calloused hands and eyes that held a depth of sadness he understood instinctively, was his other half. A part of him he'd never known existed. But why the secrecy? Arthur pressed, the question a raw, painful thing. The years of silence, of unanswered questions, weighed heavily on him. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. Elias sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of unspoken years. Fear mostly, fear of losing you again, fear of the complications. He gestured vaguely, his eyes drifting towards the necklace resting on the table between them. It wasn't easy, Arthur. Not for anyone. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. A legacy of lies, carefully crafted and painfully maintained. The firelight flickered, highlighting the lines of worry etched around Elias's eyes, mirroring the anxieties churning within Arthur's own heart. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations and desperate hopes. The weight of their shared history, fractured and fragmented, pressed down on them both. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning. The scent of wood smoke clung to Elias's worn tweed jacket, a stark contrast to the tailored suits Arthur was accustomed to. He watched his brother, the resemblance striking yet subtly different, Elias's lines etched by sun and work, Arthur's by stress and indulgence. The cottage, despite its humble charm, felt more welcoming than Arthur's palatial home ever had. Complications, Arthur repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. What complications? My entire life has been a complication because of this secret. His voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade of composure crumbling. The years of loneliness, of unanswered questions, surged to the surface, a bitter tide threatening to engulf him. Elias shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the intricately woven necklace lying on the worn wooden table between them. The firelight glinted off the ancient metal, highlighting its age and the secrets it held. Our parents, they feared a scandal. Your mother, she was from a prominent family. A connection to you, to us. It would have shattered everything they'd built. A silence descended, broken only by the crackling fire and the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Arthur ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble against his skin, a tangible representation of the years of emotional neglect. He thought of the empty spaces in his life, the void that even his wealth couldn't fill. So, I was expendable? The question hung in the air, laced with a pain that was both fresh and ancient. The accusation wasn't directed solely at Elias, but at a family history riddled with carefully constructed secrets and convenient omissions. Elias's voice was low, filled with a weariness that mirrored Arthur's own exhaustion. No, Arthur. It wasn't about expendability. It was about protection. They believed they were protecting us both, in their own twisted way. He reached out a calloused hand, hesitantly touching Arthur's arm. Believe me, the guilt has been a heavier burden than you can imagine. The contact was brief, but it carried a weight of unspoken regret, a silent apology for a lifetime of separation. The firelight danced in their eyes, reflecting the shared pain, the unspoken understanding that began to bloom between them. The air thickened with the unspoken weight of years of silence, a legacy of carefully constructed lies, painfully maintained. The reconciliation was a long way off, but in the shared silence, a fragile hope began to flicker, a tiny spark in the vast darkness. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and old books, a comforting contrast to the sterile scent of Arthur's mansion. He watched Elias stir a pot on the ancient stove, the firelight painting dancing shadows on his face. The resemblance was uncanny, yet their lives had carved such different paths. Elias's hands, calloused and strong, moved with a practiced grace that spoke of years spent working the land. Arthur's own hands, soft and pale, felt foreign and useless by comparison. So, Arthur began, his voice hesitant, This necklace, it's more than just a family heirloom, isn't it? Elias turned, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. He carefully placed a wooden spoon on the table, the sound oddly loud in the quiet cottage. It's a reminder, he murmured, his gaze dropping to the necklace lying between them. A constant reminder of what was lost, of what could have been. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and regrets. Arthur felt the familiar sting of resentment, a bitter taste he'd grown accustomed to. Years of loneliness, of believing himself to be incapable of love and family, had built a wall around his heart, a wall that even the discovery of Elias couldn't easily breach. Protection, Arthur repeated, the word a bitter whisper. They protected you, but what about me? I was left to rot in a gilded cage, convinced I was some kind of defective human being. He stood abruptly, pacing the small room, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The fire crackled, a counterpoint to the turmoil raging within him. Elias watched him, his expression pained. He reached for the necklace, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings. It wasn't simple, Arthur. They loved us both. In their own flawed way, they tried to do what they thought was best. Best? Arthur scoffed, the word dripping with sarcasm. They chose to keep us apart, to let me believe I was alone, barren. They stole my childhood, My brother, my very identity. He stopped pacing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of years of deception pressed down on him, crushing him with its force. Elias rose slowly, his gaze locking with Arthur's. They were afraid of the scandal, of the judgment. Your mother's family. They were powerful, unforgiving. They feared what would happen if the truth came out. Arthur stared at his brother, the anger slowly giving way to a weary exhaustion. The firelight glinted off the necklace, a symbol of their shared past, a bond forged in secrecy and betrayal. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was a truth he finally had the courage to face. The chasm between them remained wide, but a fragile bridge of understanding, born of shared pain and unspoken regret, had finally begun to be built. The silence hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the metallic tang of Arthur's expensive cologne, a bizarre juxtaposition in the humble cottage. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. Elias, watching him, shifted slightly, the worn wooden chair creaking a soft protest. The fire crackled, spitting sparks that danced momentarily before dying. So, Arthur began again, his voice quieter this time, laced with a weary exhaustion that belied the earlier outburst. What about children? Did they ever say? He trailed off, unable to articulate the question that burned in his throat. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Could Elias have children? Could I have children? Elias's gaze dropped to his hands, calloused and scarred from a life lived close to the earth. The necklace, nestled on the table between them, seemed to pulse faintly in the firelight. There were complications, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper lost in the crackling fire. Things weren't straightforward. He didn't elaborate. He couldn't. Arthur saw the pain flicker across Elias's face, a mirror to his own. The years of isolation, the crippling belief in his own barrenness. It all seemed to coalesce into a suffocating weight. The opulent emptiness of his mansion felt a million miles away, dwarfed by the simple truth in this small cottage. The truth of a shared past, a shared loss, a shared wound. He picked up the necklace, its cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire. He traced the intricate carvings, a silent dialogue passing between him and the object that had initiated this whole odyssey. It was a symbol of their fractured history, a constant reminder of the choices made and the life paths diverged. He looked at Elias, really looked at him beyond the years of separation, beyond the differences in their lives. He saw the reflection of himself, a twin soul forged in sorrow and secrecy. The anger that had dominated him so completely was slowly replaced by a profound sadness. A sadness tinged with an awakening hope. The chasm remained, but this time it felt less unbridgeable. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across Elias's weathered face. Arthur, still clutching the necklace, felt a strange kinship with the worn wood of the cottage, a stark contrast to the polished marble of his mansion. He saw the lines etched around Elias's eyes, a roadmap of a life lived differently, a life he'd never known. Complicated? He repeated softly, the word hanging in the air like smoke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling fire. Elias shifted again, his gaze falling to the intricately carved necklace resting on the table between them. Our mother, she believed it was for the best, he finally said, his voice raspy, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. She thought separating us was the only way to protect us. The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their years apart. Arthur felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a wave of profound sadness. Protection? At what cost? He envisioned his opulent, lonely life, the hollow echo of laughter in his echoing mansion. His life, a gilded cage built on a foundation of lies. Protect us from what? Arthur's voice was barely a whisper, a tremor running through him. He felt the cool metal of the necklace against his skin, a tangible reminder of the secret that had shaped their lives. The scent of wood smoke, sharp and earthy, filled his lungs, a visceral reminder of his brother's life, so vastly different from his own. He imagined his parents, their faces blurred by time and grief, making impossible choices. Elias looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "From him," he said, his gaze drifting towards the shadowed corner of the cottage. "From our uncle." The name hung unspoken between them, a dark cloud gathering on the horizon of their newly discovered past. A truth darker and more complex than the simple separation of twins. The fire crackled, a sharp sound in the suffocating silence that followed. Arthur felt a cold dread creep into his heart, a premonition of a revelation that would shatter any fragile hope he'd managed to salvage. The necklace, cold metal against his skin, felt suddenly heavy, a weighty symbol of the family secrets yet to be unearthed. The truth, it seemed, was far more intricate and devastating than he could have ever imagined. The cottage's silence pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating. The scent of wood smoke, sharp and acrid, mingled with the earthy aroma of damp soil. Arthur ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the necklace, the intricate carvings digging faintly into his palm. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of the dread Elias's words had ignited. "Our uncle." The unspoken name echoed in the space between them, a chilling whisper in the crackling fire's symphony. Elias avoided Arthur's gaze, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames, their light dancing erratically on his weathered face. The years had etched a map of hardship onto his features, a stark contrast to Arthur's carefully preserved youthfulness. A chasm yawned between them, wider than the miles that separated their lives, deeper than the secrets their family had buried. "Tell me." Arthur's voice was low, gravelly with unshed tears. The word hung in the air, a fragile plea in the face of looming devastation. He felt the weight of decades of lies crushing him, the opulent loneliness of his life a bitter mockery. Elias's sigh was a rustling of dry leaves. He finally met Arthur's eyes, his own filled with a pain that mirrored his own, yet carried the weight of different burdens. "It's a long story," he began, his voice hoarse. "A story of greed and desperation." He paused, his gaze drifting towards a shadowed corner of the room, the unspoken presence of their uncle heavy in the air. The fire crackled, a sharp sound in the pregnant silence. The weight of the untold story pressed down on Arthur, a suffocating blanket of anticipation and fear. The necklace, cold against his skin, felt less like an heirloom and more like a shackle. The truth, it seemed, was about to unleash itself, a torrent of pain and revelation poised to break the fragile peace of their first encounter. The taste of ashes filled Arthur's mouth, bitter and overwhelming. This was not just a revelation of a brother. It was a reckoning. The cottage's silence, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, felt heavier than the secrets it held. Arthur traced the cool, smooth surface of the necklace, the intricate carvings a stark contrast to the rough-hewn wood of the table. Elias, his twin, sat opposite, his face etched with a weariness that spoke of a life lived far from Arthur's gilded cage. The fire cast flickering shadows, turning familiar features into fleeting masks. "Desperation," Elias repeated, the word catching in his throat. "Our parents, they were desperate." He looked away, towards the faded floral wallpaper, his eyes clouding with unshed tears. They believed separating us was the only way to save us." Arthur's heart clenched. The scent of wood smoke, sharp and acrid, filled his lungs, mirroring the bitterness rising in his chest. "Save us from what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper above the crackling fire. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with unspoken accusations and long-buried pain. Elias shifted in his chair, the worn fabric creaking softly. "From him," he finally said, the single word heavy with the weight of years of suppressed anger and fear. He glanced at the necklace, then back at Arthur. "From our uncle." The name hung in the air, a venomous dart aimed at the heart of Arthur's carefully constructed world. The revelation sliced through the carefully maintained facade of Arthur's controlled existence. The opulent mansion, the endless stream of meaningless social engagements, the hollow ache of childlessness, all felt suddenly insignificant, overshadowed by the monstrous secret that had shaped their lives. He stared at his brother, at the lines of worry etched deep into his face, the calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor, and saw a reflection of a life he'd never known, a life lived outside the gilded cage of his own making. The weight of their shared history pressed down on him, a crushing burden of secrets, betrayals, and lost years. The necklace, once a symbol of a mysterious past, now felt like a tangible link to a chain of pain he was only just beginning to understand. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the hearth, a tiny counterpoint to the storm brewing within him. Arthur felt the first tears prick his eyes, hot and unexpected. The comfortable distance of his wealth and privilege seemed miles away, leaving him exposed, raw, vulnerable to the brutal truth unfolding before him. The confrontation had begun, a painful excavation of a past shrouded in deceit and driven by a desperation he was only just beginning to comprehend. The flickering gaslight cast long, dancing shadows across the worn wooden floorboards of Elias's cottage. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, clung to Arthur's expensive suit like a second skin, a stark contrast to his usual opulent surroundings. He watched Elias, his twin, his face etched with a lifetime of hardship, meticulously mend a fishing net. The rhythmic motion seemed a counterpoint to the turmoil raging within Arthur. "It wasn't just desperation," Arthur finally said, his voice rough with unshed tears. The words, heavier than he anticipated, hung in the air. He felt the familiar coldness of the necklace against his skin, a chilling reminder of the weight of their shared history. Elias paused, his calloused fingers stilling on the frayed twine. He looked up, his gaze meeting Arthur's with a mixture of apprehension and defiance. "It was protection," he whispered, his voice low and strained. He wanted to control everything." The silence stretched, thin and taut, broken only by the crackling fire. Arthur felt a wave of nausea, the opulent comfort of his life suddenly a suffocating weight. He pictured his parents, their faces blurred by time and the veil of secrecy, their choices echoing in the grim revelation. "Our uncle," Arthur repeated, testing the name on his tongue, tasted like ash and bitter regret. The image of a man he'd never known, yet felt intrinsically linked to, filled his mind. A man who wielded power and influence, a shadow looming large in their shared past. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the ancient necklace resting on Arthur's chest. "He wanted to inherit everything. He saw us as obstacles." A tremor ran through his usually stoic demeanor, the years of suppressed anger and fear finally cracking the surface. Arthur felt a searing pain in his chest, a raw, physical ache mirroring the emotional devastation unfolding before him. The carefully constructed facade of his life crumbled, replaced by a desolate landscape of betrayal and loss. His inability to have children, once a source of profound grief, now felt insignificant compared to the monstrous secret that had poisoned their family's history, a secret that had shaped their lives in ways neither of them fully understood. The necklace, a symbol of inheritance, now felt like a brand, a mark of their shared pain. The confrontation was far from over. It was only the beginning of a painful, necessary reckoning. The cottage felt colder now, the fire's warmth insufficient to thaw the chill that had settled deep in Arthur's bones. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window pane, a stranger staring back, eyes shadowed with grief and a dawning understanding. The weight of the necklace, a physical manifestation of his family's dark history, pressed against his chest. He needed Isabella. He found her waiting at the edge of the village, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. The sight offered no comfort. "He wanted control," Arthur repeated, the words tasting like ash. "He saw Elias and me as obstacles." Isabella listened, her expression a blend of sympathy and professional detachment. The crisp evening air whipped strands of her dark hair across her face as she reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. The touch, surprisingly comforting, was a lifeline in the swirling vortex of his emotions. "It explains the infertility," Isabella murmured, her voice barely audible above the wind's whisper. A deliberate act, perhaps, to ensure his legacy remained unchallenged. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his unspoken fears. The possibility was horrifying, a cruel twist in a narrative already brimming with betrayal. He had spent years believing his barrenness a personal failing. Now, it felt like a deliberate act of cruelty, orchestrated by a relative he'd never known. "But why the necklace?" he asked, his voice raw with pain. "Why this bizarre inheritance?" Isabella traced the intricate silverwork of the necklace in his hand. "Perhaps it was a twisted form of control," she mused, her eyes thoughtful. "A constant reminder of their shared blood, a link to the man who manipulated their lives." The unspoken question hung in the air. What other secrets remained buried beneath the surface of their family's history? The journey back to his mansion was silent, the opulence of his surroundings mocking the desolation within him. The familiar luxury felt suffocating, each polished surface reflecting his fractured reflection. The once comforting silence of his home now echoed with the ghosts of his past. The necklace, no longer a symbol of inheritance, but a cruel reminder of manipulation and stolen lineage, rested heavily on his chest. He knew the healing wouldn't be swift. The path towards understanding was long and arduous, fraught with the ghosts of those who had sought to control his destiny. But for the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of hope, a hope fueled not by his wealth, but by the possibility of connection, of a relationship with a brother he never knew existed, a relationship that could finally fill the empty spaces in his heart. The cottage's meager fire cast long, dancing shadows. Arthur, huddled in a worn armchair, felt the chill seep into his bones, mirroring the icy grip of betrayal. The necklace, heavy against his chest, felt less like an heirloom and more like a shackle. Isabella's presence, a quiet strength in the corner, was a fragile bomb. He watched the flames flicker, mirroring the unsteady hope flickering within him. "Control," he whispered, the word catching in his throat. He wanted absolute control. Isabella nodded, her gaze understanding, yet professional. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of his mansion. He longed for that sterile environment, yet knew it offered no solace. "He saw Elias and me as obstacles," Arthur continued, his voice raw with pain. The weight of years of unknowing pressed down, a crushing burden. The quiet crackle of the fire was the only sound for a long moment. "The infertility," Isabella began, her voice soft, careful. "It wasn't a biological impossibility, was it?" The question hung heavy, unanswered for a beat. Then the confession spilled out. He ensured it. He manipulated things. The admission was a physical blow, leaving Arthur breathless and drained. The revelation was monstrous, a cruel twist of fate. He had lived with the bitter sting of childlessness, believing it a personal failure. Now it was a deliberate act of cruelty. "Why the necklace, then?" he croaked, the question laced with anguish. This baffling inheritance, this constant reminder of a lineage tainted by manipulation. Isabella traced the intricate silverwork, her fingers lingering on a tiny, almost invisible inscription. A twisted symbol, perhaps, a constant reminder of their shared blood, a link to the man who controlled their lives. The journey back was silent, the opulence of his mansion a jarring contradiction to the emotional devastation within. Each polished surface reflected a fractured self, a man stripped bare by the truth. The necklace remained, a heavy weight, a constant reminder not of heritage, but of a devastating betrayal. He knew the road to healing was long, but for the first time, a flicker of hope, fragile yet persistent, illuminated the darkness. It was a hope born not of wealth, but of a possible connection with a brother, a chance to fill the emptiness that had haunted him for so long. The rain lashed against the windows of Arthur's mansion, a relentless rhythm mirroring the turmoil within him. He sat alone, the ancient necklace cold against his skin, its intricate silverwork a stark contrast to the warmth he desperately craved. Isabella's words echoed in his ears. A twisted symbol, a constant reminder. He traced the inscription, his fingers numb with a mixture of grief and anger. The phone rang, shattering the silence. It was Elias. Arthur hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. The fear of rejection, of another painful confrontation, threatened to overwhelm him. But something shifted. A fragile ember of hope flickered, casting a small light in the vast darkness. He picked up the phone. "Hello?" His voice was barely a whisper. Elias's voice, hesitant yet warm, filled the space. "Arthur, I was wondering if you might want to talk." A lump formed in Arthur's throat. He cleared it, trying for a casual tone he didn't feel. "Yes, Elias, of course." The weight of unspoken years hung heavy between them, a palpable tension that even the distance of the phone line couldn't erase. The conversation was slow, halting at first, punctuated by long silences filled with unspoken regrets and a shared history of pain. They talked about their childhood, about the vague memories they had of each other, fragments of a life stolen from them. The silences became less frequent, replaced by a hesitant exploration of their shared past. Arthur felt a surprising sense of relief, a lessening of the heavy burden he had carried for so long. He realized the necklace was not a shackle, but a thread, a fragile connection to a brother he had never known. The rain continued outside, but within the confines of the conversation, a tentative warmth began to bloom. The sterile opulence of his mansion faded, replaced by a quiet understanding, a flicker of hope for a future he had never dared to imagine. This was not just about uncovering a secret. It was about mending a broken heart, about finding a family he never knew he had lost. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it, hand in hand with his brother. The ancient necklace a symbol not of betrayal but of a newfound bond. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth clung to Arthur's clothes, a stark contrast to the sterile perfume of his mansion. He sat on the worn porch swing of Elias's small cottage, the rhythmic creak a soothing counterpoint to the tempest in his soul. Isabella's words still echoed. "He needs you, Arthur, more than you know." He looked at his hands, calloused from a lifetime of privilege, oddly out of place in this rustic setting. Elias emerged from the cottage, a steaming mug in his hands. His face, though mirroring Arthur's, held a weariness Arthur had never known. "Cold out here," Elias said, his voice a low rumble, a quiet echo of Arthur's own refined tones. Arthur nodded, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken years. He took the mug Elias offered, the warmth of the herbal tea seeping into his chilled fingers. "Thank you," he murmured, the word feeling foreign and clumsy. "You look different," Elias said, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Less sharp." Arthur chuckled, a self-deprecating sound. "Years of pent-up anger will do that to a man. It's surprisingly heavy." He swirled the tea, watching the steam curl into the chilly air. "I've spent my life surrounded by luxury, but it's been empty, like a gilded cage." Elias met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "I understand empty," he said softly, "but mine wasn't gilded." He gestured towards the small, lovingly tended garden. "This is my gold." Arthur watched him, a slow shift occurring within him. The chasm between them, once a gaping abyss, began to narrow. The shared resemblance, once a source of bitter resentment, now felt like a lifeline. He saw in Elias's eyes not just a mirror image of himself, but a reflection of a life he had never known, a life simpler, yet perhaps richer in genuine connection. The ancient necklace, tucked safely in his pocket, felt less like a burden and more like a shared legacy, a tangible link to a brother he was only beginning to understand. The rain, a constant presence throughout his journey, now felt less relentless, more like a gentle cleansing. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, the path wasn't lonely. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on Elias's weathered face. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy aroma of brewing herbs, a comforting contrast to Arthur's usual sterile, perfumed environment. He watched Elias, his twin, stirring a pot with a worn wooden spoon, the movements oddly familiar, yet profoundly alien. The years of separation stretched between them, a vast, unforgiving gulf. "It wasn't easy," Elias finally said, his voice low and gravelly, breaking the silence. He didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the simmering pot. Growing up, alone, people stared, whispered. It wasn't normal. Arthur felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unexpected. He'd been consumed by his own losses, his own perceived failures, blind to the parallel suffering of his brother. He'd imagined a life of ease for Elias, a life free from the burdens he himself carried. The reality was far harsher. I never knew," Arthur stammered, the words catching in his throat. The weight of his ignorance pressed down on him, suffocating. The luxury he'd taken for granted felt obscene now, a stark reminder of the disparity in their lives. Elias finally looked up, his eyes mirroring Arthur's, yet holding a different depth, a quiet resilience born of struggle. "I built a life, a good one, but—" He paused, a flicker of sadness crossing his features. "It wasn't the life I imagined. Not with you." A silence fell, filled only with the crackling fire and the gentle wind sighing through the trees outside. The shared silence, heavy with unspoken regret and a dawning understanding, felt strangely comforting. It was a shared silence, not a chasm. Arthur reached out, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, placing his hand over Elias's on the worn wooden table. The contact, a simple gesture, sparked a profound connection. It wasn't a sudden erasure of years of pain, but a first, tentative step across the vast divide that had separated them. The warmth of Elias's hand, rough and calloused, felt strangely reassuring, a tangible link to a life he'd longed for, a brotherhood he was finally beginning to claim. The cabin's rough-hewn walls seemed to breathe, exhaling the scent of pine and damp earth. Rain lashed against the windows, a steady rhythm against the silence between the brothers. Arthur, used to the hushed elegance of his mansion, felt oddly comforted by the raw simplicity of the space. Elias, however, seemed to shrink further into himself, his hands twisting the worn fabric of his trousers. "It's different," Arthur finally said, the words clumsy and inadequate. He gestured around the small cabin, trying to fill the silence with something, anything. The flickering lamplight highlighted the lines etched on Elias's face, the evidence of a life lived far from the gilded cage of Arthur's existence. Elias nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Different is good," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. Normal was suffocating. He looked up, meeting Arthur's gaze directly for the first time. There was a weariness in his eyes, a deep-seated sadness that pierced Arthur's carefully constructed defenses. The rain intensified, mirroring the storm brewing within Arthur. He thought of his sterile, opulent home, the emptiness that had haunted him for so long. He'd sought solace in wealth, in possessions, but it had yielded nothing but a hollow echo. Here, in this small, humble cabin, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and the sound of relentless rain, he felt a strange sense of belonging, of finally being home. I'm sorry," Arthur said, the words raw and sincere, "for everything, for not knowing, for being so blind." Elias sighed, a sound heavy with years of unspoken regret. He rose and walked to the window, his back to Arthur. "It wasn't your fault," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. They made choices, difficult choices, choices I've spent my life trying to understand." The rain continued its relentless assault, washing away the dust of years, leaving behind a space for something new, something fragile yet promising. The shared silence, no longer a chasm but a shared burden, felt less heavy, less suffocating. A tentative hope, delicate as a newborn flower pushing through hardened earth, bloomed in the quiet space between the two brothers. The necklace, nestled safely in Arthur's pocket, felt less like a symbol of separation and more like a promise of a future where the threads of their lives, once severed, would slowly begin to intertwine again. The cabin's warmth, a stark contrast to the relentless rain outside, did little to thaw the chill between them. Arthur watched Elias, the flickering lamplight catching the silver in his thinning hair. He saw a lifetime of hardship etched into the lines around his eyes, a life lived far from the opulence Arthur had always known. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof. Arthur shifted uncomfortably, the necklace, cool against his skin, a constant reminder of the fractured past. I don't know what to say," he finally admitted, his voice rough with unshed tears. The words felt inadequate, flimsy against the weight of years of separation and unspoken grievances. Elias sighed, a sound as worn as the worn armchair he sat in. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong from years of honest labor, a stark contrast to Arthur's own pale, soft ones. "There's nothing to say," he replied quietly, his voice tinged with a quiet resignation. "It's just strange, seeing you here." A log in the fireplace crackled, spitting a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the room, highlighting the subtle similarities between them. The set of their jaw, the curve of their lips. A shared heritage, brutally severed, yet undeniably present. "Strange isn't the word," Arthur countered, his voice raw with emotion. "It's surreal, like looking in a mirror, but seeing a life I never lived." He paused, searching for the right words, the words that could bridge the chasm between them. "I've spent my life empty, haunted by a loneliness I couldn't understand. And now," he trailed off, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Elias finally met his gaze, his eyes filled with a complex mix of sadness and understanding. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I felt it too, just differently." He rose, walking towards the window, his silhouette framed against the stormy night. The rain seemed to mirror the storm within them both, a cathartic cleansing of years of silence and regret. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, a potent reminder of their shared, though disparate, roots. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer a barrier but a shared space, pregnant with unspoken emotions, a space for healing to begin. The cabin's rough-hewn table held a chipped mug, steaming with something vaguely herbal. Elias, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid, spoke quietly, his voice barely a whisper above the crackling fire. They told me you were dead." The confession hung in the air, thick with unspoken years. Arthur felt a familiar ache in his chest, a raw, persistent throb that mirrored the rhythmic thump of the rain against the cabin walls. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the damp earth outside, a poignant backdrop to their fragile reunion. "They lied," Arthur responded, his voice equally low. The weight of the revelation, the decades of deception, pressed down on him. He traced the intricate carvings on the necklace, its cool metal a stark contrast to the rough wood of the table. "They lied about a lot of things." A long silence followed, broken only by the crackling fire and the relentless rain. Elias finally looked up, his eyes, the same shade of gray as Arthur's, filled with a weariness that spoke volumes. "I always wondered," he began, his voice hesitant, "if it was my fault, if I'd done something to deserve being discarded." Arthur reached across the table, his hand hovering over Elias's. The gesture was tentative, uncertain, a fragile bridge across a chasm of lost years. "It wasn't your fault, Elias. None of it was." The words, though heartfelt, felt inadequate, a pale substitute for the emotional wreckage of their shared history. He saw the subtle tremor in Elias's hand and felt a pang of sympathy for the life his brother had endured. I built a life," Elias continued, his voice gaining strength. "A good life, but it was always incomplete, a missing piece. And now, He looked at Arthur, searching his eyes, the years of separation melting away in a shared glance of recognition. Now, the missing piece is here. He squeezed Arthur's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pain and the tentative hope that bloomed between them in the heart of the storm. The rain outside intensified, but within the small cabin, a fragile warmth began to take root. The fire crackled, spitting embers that danced in the dim light of the cabin. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury Arthur was accustomed to. He watched Elias, the lines etched deeply around his eyes a testament to a life lived far from opulence. A life, Arthur realized with a pang of guilt, that had been unjustly denied the comfort and security he had always taken for granted. It wasn't just the money, Arthur finally said, his voice rough. The confession hung between them, heavy with unspoken resentments. He shifted uncomfortably on the rough-hewn stool, the wood digging into his finely tailored trousers. It was everything, the opportunities, the choices. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I never resented you for that," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "But I resented them for taking you, for taking us." The unspoken accusation hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Arthur felt a familiar wave of shame wash over him. His parents' decisions, shrouded in secrecy and regret, had cast a long shadow over both their lives. He reached for the necklace, its cool smoothness a comfort against his skin. I'm trying to understand," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What they were thinking, why they did it." Elias lifted his gaze, meeting Arthur's. The years melted away in that shared glance, revealing a profound understanding that transcended their differences. "Fear," Elias said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Fear of losing everything. Fear of not being enough." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in the memories of a past he could never reclaim. "They were afraid of losing you, Arthur. And in their fear, they lost us both." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of their shared history, the decades of separation and the unspoken hurts. The rain hammered against the roof, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the beating of Arthur's heart. He looked at Elias, really saw him for the first time, and a profound sense of empathy filled him. This wasn't just a brother. It was a part of himself, lost and found amidst the wreckage of a fractured family. The missing piece, as Elias had said, had finally arrived. The fragile warmth of a tentative connection began to blossom in the cold heart of the storm. The cabin's rough-hewn table held a meager supper: bread, cheese, and a pot of weak tea. The scent of wood smoke, sharp and comforting, mingled with the damp chill clinging to Arthur's expensive suit. He watched Elias meticulously spread butter on a slice of bread, the simple act somehow heartbreaking in its ordinariness. The contrast between Elias's calloused hands and his own perfectly manicured ones was a stark visual representation of their vastly different lives. "The necklace," Arthur began, his voice hesitant, breaking the heavy silence. He traced the delicate silver filigree, its cool weight a familiar comfort. It felt like a key to something I never understood. Elias looked up, his eyes, the same shade of gray as Arthur's, filled with a weary sadness. "It was a key, Arthur, a key to a truth they tried to bury." He paused, taking a slow bite of bread. "They thought they were protecting us, but in reality, they were only protecting themselves." The rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the cabin's roof. The storm outside mirrored the tempest raging within Arthur. He thought of his parents, their faces a blur of half-remembered smiles and cold silences. He'd always felt a void, a hollowness at the center of his life, a void he'd tried to fill with wealth and possessions. "I never knew," Arthur whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I never knew I had a brother." Elias nodded, his gaze distant. "Nor did I know I had you. A world of difference between our lives, but still." He looked at Arthur, a flicker of something akin to hope in his eyes. "Still the same blood." Arthur reached across the table, his hand hovering over Elias's. The contact was hesitant, tentative, yet the unspoken understanding that passed between them felt stronger than words. The years of separation, the silence, the lies, they were all starting to unravel, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning connection. The necklace, lying between them, seemed to pulse with a newfound significance, a silent testament to a bond forged in secrecy and rediscovered amidst the storm. The rain continued to fall, but inside the small cabin, a faint warmth began to bloom, thawing the icy grip of years of sorrow and regret. The journey to reconciliation was long, but in this shared moment, the first tentative steps were taken. The next morning, sunlight slanted through the cabin's small window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The storm had passed, leaving behind the crisp scent of pine and damp earth. Arthur woke with a start, the memory of the previous night's revelation clinging to him like the lingering chill. He looked at Elias, who slept soundly, his face relaxed, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Arthur's own heart. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic chirping of unseen birds. Arthur got up, the rough-hewn floorboards cool beneath his bare feet. He poured himself a cup of the remaining tea, the bitter brew strangely comforting. He watched Elias stir, his eyes opening slowly, a question in their gray depths. "Morning," Arthur said, his voice rough from disuse. Elias nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "The storm's gone." "Yes," Arthur replied, the simple statement carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. He picked up the necklace, the silver cool against his skin. This changes everything." Elias reached for it, his fingers brushing Arthur's. The brief touch sent a jolt of electricity through Arthur, a recognition that transcended years of separation. "It's a part of us," Elias murmured, turning the necklace over in his hands. A reminder of what was lost and what might be found. A heavy silence settled between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the dying fire. Arthur felt a wave of grief wash over him, grief for the lost years, the missed opportunities, the chasm that had separated them. He thought of his parents, their faces still hazy, their choices still shrouded in mystery. He saw the fear in their eyes, the burden they carried, and understood for the first time the immensity of their sacrifice. The anger he'd harbored began to dissipate, replaced by a weary compassion. I'm sorry," Arthur finally said, the words thick with emotion. "For everything. For not knowing. For the life I lived. For assuming." Elias's gaze softened. "Don't," he said quietly. "We both lost out. But maybe we can start to make up for it." He looked at Arthur, a genuine smile replacing the weariness. "We're brothers, Arthur, and that's something they can't take away from us." The sun climbed higher, bathing the cabin in a warm, golden light. Outside, the world seemed new, reborn after the storm. And inside the cabin, a fragile hope took root, a fragile seed of reconciliation in the fertile ground of a shared past and a promising future. The cabin's rough-hewn walls seemed to breathe with the quiet of the morning. Sunlight, fractured by the frost-laced window panes, painted shifting patterns on the worn wooden floor. Arthur, still reeling from the previous night's revelations, watched Elias dress, the movements slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to Arthur's own internal turmoil. The scent of pine needles and wood smoke hung heavy in the air, a tangible reminder of their shared isolation. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unexpected. Years of self-imposed solitude, a life built on assumptions and fueled by a carefully constructed loneliness, now felt grotesquely inadequate. He had been so consumed by his own perceived failures, he'd overlooked the possibility of a profound connection, a bond that transcended blood and circumstance. "The necklace," Arthur began, his voice hoarse. "It belonged to our mother, didn't it?" Elias paused, his hand hovering over the simple, patched tunic he was wearing. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, yet it held the weight of untold stories. "Yes," he replied softly, his gaze distant, lost in the echoes of a shared past. She always kept it close. Silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackling embers of the dying fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. Arthur felt the weight of years of unspoken words, of lost opportunities and fractured relationships. He saw, in the lines etched around Elias's eyes, the same quiet sadness that had haunted his own life. It was a shared inheritance, far more precious than any heirloom. I never understood," Arthur confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I judged them, both my parents. I resented their silence, their perceived neglect." He trailed off, the words inadequate to capture the complexity of his feelings. Elias nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They did what they thought was best. In their own way, they loved us both." His voice was low, filled with a quiet acceptance that both surprised and moved Arthur. He saw a flicker of something he hadn't noticed before: forgiveness. Not just for their parents, but for himself and his brother too. The sun climbed higher, casting a warmer glow over the cabin. The storm had passed, both literally and metaphorically, leaving behind a space for something new to grow. The air, thick with unspoken emotions, now held the promise of healing, a tentative hope for a future they could build together. The necklace, resting on the rough-hewn table between them, became a symbol not of separation, but of the enduring strength of a familial bond, forged in the crucible of loss and rediscovery. The scent of wood smoke clung to Arthur's clothes, a stark contrast to the expensive fabrics he usually wore. He watched Elias carefully, noting the calloused hands that spoke of a life lived far from the gilded cages of Arthur's existence. A shared silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken apologies and years of separation. The cabin, small and simple, felt intimate in a way Arthur's mansion never had. I don't know how to do this," Arthur finally admitted, the words catching in his throat. The confession, raw and vulnerable, hung in the air. Elias looked up, his gaze meeting Arthur's. A faint smile played on his lips. "Neither do I," he replied, his voice low and hesitant. "But perhaps we can learn together." He reached out, a hesitant gesture, and placed a hand on Arthur's arm, a simple touch that carried the weight of decades. The warmth of Elias's hand surprised Arthur. It was a stark contrast to the chill he had carried within himself for so long. A wave of emotion washed over him: relief, guilt, and a burgeoning hope he hadn't dared to allow himself to feel before. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Arthur saw the reflection of his own face in Elias's eyes, a younger, less burdened version of himself, yet undeniably the same. The shared resemblance, once a source of bewilderment and anger, now felt like a lifeline. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky with soft pastels. A new day was breaking, mirroring the tentative hope blooming within Arthur's heart. He looked at Elias, truly saw him for the first time, not as a rival or a ghost from a forgotten past, but as a brother. The necklace, lying between them, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, a silent witness to a fragile, yet profound reconciliation. The inheritance of silence was finally breaking, giving way to the promise of a shared future, built on the foundation of a newly discovered brotherhood. The journey had been long and arduous, but the dawn brought with it the promise of a new beginning, a new family, and a newfound sense of belonging. The days that followed were a blur of hesitant conversations and shared silences. Arthur, accustomed to the sterile perfection of his mansion, found himself strangely comforted by the rough-hewn simplicity of Elias's cabin. The smell of pine and wood smoke, initially jarring, now felt grounding. He learned about Elias's life, the quiet joy of tending his small garden, the satisfaction of carpentry, the deep love for his wife and children. These were things Arthur had always craved, unaware of their existence. One evening, huddled around the crackling fire, Elias spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I always knew there was someone else," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Mom and Dad, they never quite explained it, but the necklace, it always felt like a connection, a secret promise." Arthur nodded, the weight of years pressing down on him. The necklace, once a symbol of mystery and anger, now felt like a tangible link to a past he was only beginning to understand. He reached out, picking it up gingerly. The cool metal felt strangely comforting against his skin. "They carried so much guilt," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years." The silence. Elias's hand covered Arthur's, his touch surprisingly strong. "They loved us, Arthur, in their own way." A long silence fell between them, filled only with the crackling fire and the soft chirping of crickets. The unspoken words hung in the air, a testament to the years of separation and the slow, painful process of reconciliation. Arthur finally spoke, his voice breaking slightly. "I never knew how to be a son. I always felt distant, disconnected." Elias squeezed his hand. "We both did," he replied softly. "But it's not too late. We can be brothers now." The next morning, Arthur awoke to a fresh blanket of snow. The world outside was transformed, pristine and silent. A sense of peace settled over him, a calm he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Elias, sitting by the fire, his face softened by the morning light. The resemblance was striking, yet the differences were equally profound, a testament to their vastly different lives. Yet, in that shared gaze, he saw something far more important: a shared history, a burgeoning brotherhood, and the promise of a future built on understanding, forgiveness, and love. The ancient necklace lay on the table, bathed in the morning sun, a silent witness to their new beginning. The inheritance of silence had finally been broken. The cabin, small and cozy, felt a world away from Arthur's sterile mansion. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy fragrance of pine, a comforting contrast to the sterile perfume that always clung to his clothes. He watched Elias, his twin, meticulously whittle a piece of wood, the rhythmic scrape of the knife a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in his own heart. He'd expected animosity, a mirror image of his own bitterness. Instead, he found a quiet strength, a resilience forged in a life far removed from his own gilded cage. "It's different," Arthur finally said, the words hesitant, breaking the comfortable silence. Elias looked up, his eyes so like Arthur's, yet etched with a different kind of weariness, held a surprising gentleness. "Different how?" "Everything," Arthur admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Your life, it's real." A small smile touched Elias's lips. "Real enough." He resumed his whittling, the knife moving with practiced ease. "And yours?" It felt unreal, from the stories Mom and Dad shared. The unspoken accusations hung in the air, thick and heavy. The guilt that had been gnawing at Arthur for years intensified. He'd built his life on a foundation of emptiness, a carefully constructed facade masking a deep yearning for connection. He thought of his parents, the fractured memories, the unanswered questions. Their love, if it existed, was buried under layers of deceit and secrets. They loved us," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm of years and unspoken pain. Elias nodded slowly. "I know. In their own twisted way, they thought they were protecting us." The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the raw emotion on both their faces. The ancient necklace, resting on the table between them, seemed to pulse with a silent energy, a tangible link to the past they were both struggling to understand. It was a symbol, not just of their shared history, but of the fragile, tentative hope for a future forged in forgiveness and understanding. The air hummed with unspoken words, the weight of decades lifting ever so slightly. The journey to reconciliation had only just begun. The scent of wood smoke clung to Elias's clothes, a stark contrast to Arthur's usual expensive cologne. He watched his brother carefully, noting the calloused hands, the lines etched deep around his kind eyes. A life lived outdoors, far removed from the sterile luxury of Arthur's mansion. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and the ghosts of a shared past. I never knew," Arthur finally said, the words catching in his throat. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, a familiar ache of loss and regret. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. The flames danced, mirroring the turmoil within them both. Neither did I, until Isabella found me. A log shifted in the hearth, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Arthur watched them, mesmerized, each tiny burst of light reflecting the fragmented pieces of his memory, the puzzle of his life slowly beginning to take shape. I wanted a child, Arthur confessed, the words raw and vulnerable. Always, and I blamed myself. I thought I was broken. He felt a tear escape, tracing a path down his cheek. Elias reached across the small space separating them, his hand covering Arthur's. The touch was surprisingly gentle, a balm to Arthur's wounded soul. You're not broken, Arthur. We both suffered because of them. The unspoken words hung between them, the parents, their choices, their secrets. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, a heavy blanket woven from years of silence and lies. They were afraid, Arthur whispered, the realization dawning slowly, a painful truth finally emerging from the shadows. Afraid of losing us both. Elias squeezed Arthur's hand, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. They loved us, Arthur, in their own way, a twisted, misguided way, but love nonetheless. The necklace lay on the table between them, a silent witness to their shared history. It was a tangible link to a past they were both struggling to reconcile, a symbol of the enduring bonds of family. Even in the face of unimaginable pain and betrayal, the fire crackled, casting long shadows, and in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, a fragile hope began to bloom. The journey to reconciliation was long, arduous, but it had begun. The cabin's rough-hewn beams creaked a gentle lullaby as Arthur stared into the fire. The flames licked at the logs, mirroring the restless energy within him. He'd spent the last few days in a daze, the revelation of Elias shattering the carefully constructed walls of his solitary life. Childlessness, once a gnawing emptiness, felt different now. Less a personal failure, more a consequence of a fractured past. It's strange, he murmured, breaking the silence. To think we could have had each other all this time. Elias, his face softened by the firelight, nodded slowly. Strange and painful. He picked up the ancient necklace, its intricate silverwork catching the light. This was always meant to bring us together, wasn't it? Arthur reached for it, his fingers tracing the cool metal. Felt weighty, not just physically, but with the burden of generations. I never understood, he whispered. Why they kept it hidden, why they kept us apart. Fear, Elias said simply. Fear of losing one, then the other. They loved us, Arthur, in their own flawed, desperate way. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the small space, a comforting aroma amidst the lingering tension. A quiet settled between them, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of their shared history. The anger, the resentment, had begun to recede, replaced by a tentative hope, a cautious optimism. The necklace, once a symbol of mystery and pain, now held the promise of a future they could build together. A future where the absence of children didn't define them, but the presence of brotherhood did. The fire crackled, a comforting counterpoint to the quiet strength growing between the two brothers. The long road to healing had begun, and in the heart of the wilderness, a new family was slowly taking root. The crisp morning air bit at Arthur's cheeks as he and Elias walked along the shore. The rhythmic crash of waves against the pebbles was a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil still simmering within him. He glanced at his brother, his twin, the man who looked so much like him yet felt so utterly foreign. The familiar silver necklace, now nestled safely in Arthur's pocket, felt heavy with the weight of their shared history. I still don't understand, Arthur began, his voice catching slightly. The salty air stung his eyes, blurring the already hazy landscape. Why they kept us apart. Why they chose to Erase me from your life. Elias sighed, kicking at a loose stone. The sun glinted off his dark hair, a mirror image of Arthur's own. Fear, Arthur. Blind, crippling fear. They believed they were protecting us, shielding us from something. He paused, the wind whipping a stray strand of hair across his face. They were wrong. A silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the relentless sea. Arthur watched a gull circle overhead, its cry echoing the unspoken questions hanging in the air. He thought about his empty mansion, the echoing halls, the sterile perfection that had offered no solace. Now he saw a different kind of emptiness, a void that only brotherhood could fill. I never knew how to be a brother, Arthur admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The confession hung heavy in the air, laden with regret. I never even knew I had one. Elias smiled, a small, sad smile that hinted at years of unspoken longing. We have time now, he said softly, extending a hand. Arthur hesitated for a moment, then grasped it, the touch surprisingly familiar, comfortingly solid. The cold morning air seemed to soften, the weight of the past lessening with each passing moment. The necklace, unseen but felt, pulsed with a silent promise of a future they would build together. A future filled not with wealth and solitude, but with the warmth of a connection that transcended blood and circumstance. A connection forged in the heart of a shared, painful past, and tempered by the unwavering hope of a future defined by brotherhood. The salty tang of the sea air filled Arthur's lungs, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of his mansion. He watched Elias, his twin, his brother, build a sandcastle for his son, a tiny replica of the majestic edifice Arthur called home. The boy, a miniature version of Elias, giggled, his laughter echoing the joy Arthur had never known. He's remarkable, Arthur said, the words catching in his throat. The weight of unspoken years pressed down on him, heavier than the ocean breeze. Elias smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, erasing the lines of hardship etched there by years of struggle. He's my world, Arthur. Everything. A wave of longing washed over Arthur. He'd spent a lifetime chasing a hollow success, building an empire of brick and mortar that offered no warmth. He watched his brother, surrounded by the simple joy of family, and a sharp pang of regret pierced him. I never had that, he whispered, the confession hanging between them like sea mist. The vast expanse of the beach seemed to stretch the silence, emphasizing the gulf that years of separation had created. Elias looked at him, his gaze steady and compassionate. You do now, he said softly, placing a hand on Arthur's arm, a gesture of solidarity. We do. The touch held the weight of unspoken apologies, unspoken forgiveness. It was a connection forged not in childhood, but in the crucible of shared loss and unexpected reunion. The setting sun cast long shadows across the sand, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The vibrant colors mirrored the subtle shift in Arthur's heart. The emptiness within him was lessening, replaced by a hesitant but growing warmth. The necklace, still heavy in his pocket, no longer felt like a burden, but a symbol of the enduring power of family, of connection, of a second chance at brotherhood. He looked at Elias, at his son, and a future once unimaginable, now shimmered with possibility. A future built not on wealth, but on love. The salty air, thick with the scent of brine and seaweed, did little to soothe the turmoil within Arthur. He watched Elias's son, a cherubic child with eyes mirroring his brother's, building a sandcastle, his small hands diligently patting the wet sand. The image struck a deep chord, a painful dissonance with the sterile perfection of his own mansion. He's remarkable, Arthur murmured, the words catching in his throat. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken years. The weight of his past, of his parents' choices, pressed down on him, suffocating. He felt the familiar sting of regret, a sharp, familiar pain behind his eyes. Elias, sensing his brother's distress, sat beside him, the setting sun casting long shadows that stretched across the beach, painting the sand in shifting hues of gold and orange. The vibrant colors seemed to mock the coldness that had so long defined Arthur's life. "He's my world, Arthur. Everything," Elias said softly, his voice a low rumble against the sound of the waves. His hand, calloused from years of hard work, rested lightly on Arthur's arm, a gesture both comforting and surprisingly familiar. Arthur looked at his brother, truly looked at him for the first time, seeing beyond the years of separation, beyond the differences in their lives. He saw the strength, the quiet resilience, the deep well of love for his son. A wave of longing, powerful and overwhelming, washed over him. The emptiness that had defined his life for so long felt less like an abyss and more like a cavern waiting to be filled. The necklace, heavy in his pocket, felt less like a burden, more like a promise. I never had that," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. The confession hung between them, fragile yet potent. Elias squeezed his arm gently. "You do now," he replied, his gaze steady and full of compassion. "We do." The simple words held the weight of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of a future built not on wealth, but on the unshakable foundation of brotherhood. The setting sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a sky ablaze with colors that mirrored the dawning hope in Arthur's heart. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Elias's modest cottage, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of wood smoke and freshly brewed coffee hung heavy, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed air of Arthur's mansion. He sat at the kitchen table, the worn wood cool beneath his hands, a feeling strangely comforting. Elias, his face etched with the lines of a life lived honestly, poured 2 mugs of coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the crisp morning air. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It held a quiet intimacy, born from shared vulnerability and a dawning understanding. I've been thinking about the necklace," Arthur began, his voice hesitant, the words catching slightly. He traced the rim of his mug, the rough ceramic grounding him. Elias nodded, his gaze steady. "It's more than just an heirloom, isn't it? It's a map." Arthur met his brother's eyes, a flicker of something akin to hope igniting within him. "A map to us, to finding each other." He felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifting from his chest. The years of isolation, the gnawing emptiness, suddenly felt less insurmountable. "Our parents, they loved us, Arthur. In their own way," Elias said, his voice low, a hint of sadness clinging to the words. He looked away, towards the rolling hills visible through the window, a nostalgic wistfulness in his eyes. "They made difficult choices, choices born of fear, of desperation, but choices made out of love, I believe." Arthur nodded slowly, the implications of his brother's words settling upon him. He thought of the cold isolation of his childhood, the echoing emptiness of his vast mansion. He thought of the decades wasted searching for something he'd had all along, right under his nose. The necklace, a tangible representation of his connection to his brother, shimmered faintly in the sunlight that caught its surface. It held the key not just to his past, but to a future he had never dared to imagine. "I want to help you, Elias," Arthur stated, his voice stronger now, imbued with a newfound purpose. "With everything I have." He paused, feeling a surge of emotion so powerful it caught him off guard, the emotion of genuine empathy. It was different from the sterile pity he'd often felt before, cold and lifeless. This was a warmth that touched his heart and spread throughout his soul. Elias smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes and creased the corners of his mouth. "That means more than you know, Arthur." The sun climbed higher, bathing the cottage in a warm, golden light. The air, thick with the scent of coffee and the quiet promise of a new beginning, felt different somehow. Lighter, hopeful. The weight of the past was still there, but it was no longer crushing, no longer suffocating. It was merely a part of their shared story, a story that was, finally, beginning to unfold. The crisp autumn air nipped at Arthur's cheeks as he stood on the cobblestone path leading to Elias's cottage. He clutched the ancient necklace, its cool weight a constant reminder of the journey that had brought him here. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled his lungs, a stark contrast to the sterile air of his mansion. He hesitated, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. This wasn't just a visit. It was a leap of faith, a step into the unknown. He'd offered financial support, a sprawling plot of land, but what he truly craved was connection. Inside, the warmth was immediate, a welcome hug after the chill outside. Elias, his face etched with worry lines softened by a hesitant smile, rose to meet him. "You came," he murmured, his voice raspy with unshed emotions. Arthur nodded, his throat thick. I wanted to see." He trailed off, unable to articulate the torrent of feelings swirling within him. He gestured to the necklace, its intricate silver gleaming softly in the firelight. It's a link, a reminder." Elias approached cautiously, his eyes tracing the familiar pattern. A flicker of pain crossed his face. "It was always meant to be," he whispered, running a calloused finger along the delicate metal. The silence that followed felt heavy, laden with unspoken words and years of separation. Arthur watched his brother, the man who looked so much like him yet lived a life so vastly different. The realization settled upon him. He wasn't just offering help, he was offering himself, a piece of himself he'd never known existed. I regret," Arthur started, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Not knowing you sooner, not understanding." Elias reached out, his hand covering Arthur's. "We both had to find our way, Arthur." His grip tightened, a silent promise of understanding. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, as if mirroring the complex emotions playing across their faces. The weight of years, of secrets and lies, began to lift, replaced by a tentative hope, a fragile bloom in the barren landscape of their past.